Hi, my name is Mick Rogers from Axial Benefits Group in Boston. We've heard from so many of you over the last few weeks with your thoughts and concerns, questions, maybe even some anxieties of what to do during this COVID crisis. So we decided that we would get a small, hand-picked, selected group of professionals in their areas and get them to give some video feedback on the questions that we're hearing right now. Some of the big questions that we've been hearing are obviously in the employee benefits and the retirement areas, but HR policies, HR practices, employment law, and maybe some other issues centered around just general finance. So if you're like any of us, your emails are still being flooded with COVID-19 updates. We thought a better format would be to get the professionals on here and to answer 4 or 5 questions that they have had, the majority of over the last few weeks. This morning's guest is Lori Glaude. Lori is, if you've been part of our client base, you know that she's becoming more and more exposure to our clients and become a good resource. She runs a company by the name of Aurora Benefit Solutions. She founded it, and they specialize in leadership training, HR training, general HR consulting. So good morning, Lori. How are you?
Morning. How are you?
I'm good. So I think this is an interesting segment because we had you on a few weeks ago and we talked about HR during the COVID crisis. One of the last questions that we asked was, and I think I said it that, I hope that this is a true statement that, that this COVID crisis at some point is going to be over. And, what should we be thinking about doing that? So we got a lot of really good feedback and people asking us to expand on that part, because I think people are now starting to think, that this crisis may come to an end and there may be some type of return post-COVID issues that are going to come up with your former brick and mortar, workforce. So I hope you don't mind if we dig right in. As this COVID crisis comes to a close and we start to come back to the now normal, the post-COVID workplace, what should we be considering before we bring people back to work?
So that's a great question, and one that should be on the minds of HR every day. And I think the best way to think about that is the who, when, what. How are you going to bring them back? And start off by doing what I would say a risk analysis. What jobs have to come back because your business is at risk? So if you need production workers back on the production line, think about, okay, what's the risk when I bring them back? Is it a congested workspace? Can I have multiple staggering shifts? Do I have remote workers that I can keep working remote? Do I need all shifts at all times coming back right away? Can I phase it in? I think you got to look at and come up with a plan that protects your employees, at the same time protects your business. So think about that in terms of phases based on what your business model risk is. The other thing that I think you have to think in advance is, how does that impact your visitors or your customers or your vendors? And what policies are you going to put in place about those folks being in your work environment? So start by that top-down evaluation of what your risk is. What is the most priority for you to bring folks back? Start there, and then work your way down from the most priority, most risk, down to your least, I don't want to say least priority, but least risk, or ways that you can mitigate that risk. Because the risk is not entirely gone.
Right. Do you know of any good resources to sort of have? It's like a comprehensive list of what we should be thinking about.
Yeah, I think one, you do a return to work safe plan. SHRM also has some great resources. Certainly your clients can call me and we can walk through and create that list.
Great.
But you need to think of risk, priorities, all the way through your training and onboarding or re-onboarding that you have to do.
Yeah, I think you made a comment last time, I think, which was really interesting, is that, you know, we as business leaders, as HR professionals, we can't just assume that everyone can come back to their desks as normal, just like as if it was a long weekend, right? I mean, there needs to be some real careful thought and some careful planning. So here, some of the other questions that I think would be important to think about is, what should I consider if employees can't come back to work, or they're afraid, or they have childcare issues because the schools have closed now, and they're dealing with childcare that is unexpected.
So for the child care issues, you still have some obligations of protected leave. So you want to have that discussion. For folks that are hesitant to come back, and I heard just yesterday from a client who asked me the question, well, you know, they're getting paid more on unemployment benefits. And what happens if that's a factor? I've heard that a lot. And I think the best way to address reluctant employees from coming back to work, first you have to think about, how do I notify them? If you're on furlough or layoff, you have to send those recall letters. So you have to have some notification documentation. So prepare your return to work letters, listen to the concerns of your employees, and engage in an interactive discussion so that you really understand why. Why is it that they're not ready to come back to work? And I think the best thing to do is to work with them, figure out an ease back to work. If they're afraid, what are they afraid of? What are their concerns? That's a good time to socialize your mitigation measures and your return to work safely, you know, the plan that you've created. Talk about that. Ask when, but recap and keep the documentation flowing in the event that you have a reluctant employee that continues. But I mean, this is a very tenuous time for employees. I think your best bet is to listen to see what they say first. Don't have any preconceived notions, you know why. And then of course, think about your protections that caring for a child that's a school age, your obligations.
So conservative approach, probably the best sort of mindset for that.
So, my approach is be conservative. You've done your risk analysis. You know who needs to come back. You may have to do a contingent workforce if you have. You may have folks that just won't come back. And you need to think about that too.
Right.
So
Right.
I think your planning is key.
Yeah, I think that's really sort of an important point, is that it all starts with that first question of what's the plan.
What's the plan? And so you can socialize that.
So let me go to another question. What changes should we be taking prior to workers returning? You know, what does the workplace now look like from your opinion?
I think that's part of your risk assessment. So think about walking through your workplace and think about risk mitigation. So where are your open spaces? How can you now put some barriers up, whether that's screens, whatever you have to do? Look at your areas where you have high touch points and give consideration, are we gonna close that? For example, if you have a water fountain, that's a high touch point. You may be better served by simply capping that and offering single bottled waters, single waters for workers to have. Think about your vending machines. Think about your workstations and your sanitation practices, your maintenance department. How are they going to double up on sanitation? Your PPE supply, what do you have on hand? Even though you're starting to open your workspace back up, you still have to have those protective measures. And I think the best way to do that is to do a walkthrough through the lens of risk mitigation. Think about who's coming in to service your machines if you're in a production environment. How are you going to give those external contractors PPE if they don't have it? What are you going to do about your break rooms? If they're small and congested, how are you going to provide a more open space? Are you going to stagger? You're going to stagger breaks? Are you going to stagger your shifts? I think you need to think about your safe workplace policies and retool them. And before folks come back, start planning your re-onboarding. And I say re-onboarding, they're not new employees, but it's a new circumstances.
Right.
So you want to have a training for your employees when they come back on what your PPE policies are, what your high touch points, how you're dealing with that, what's going to change for them. There are things that, will change. It may be think about your restrooms. Are they congested? Do you need to have some space there? Your social distancing? Do you need to have some signage that says that this is in use? Your equipment, if you're using shared equipment, you need to think about providing gloves or sanitation. If you're, let's say, operating a forklift and anybody can go on that forklift, you now have high touch. So walk through your organization through the lens of risk mitigation, put that into your plan, then start writing your onboarding. And as people come back, one of the requirements is have them sit through an onboarding session so they know the rules. There are things that you're going to have to be prepared for, like reporting symptoms.
Right. So I think what I'm hearing is, pretty basic business planning, right? Have a plan and then have a communication strategy to go with the plan, right? And all of these are huge factors that we need to be considering. What are some of the final thoughts? What should we be anticipating will change in the workplace?
So your culture will change a little bit because the world has changed. So I think you want to be prepared for anxious employees. I mean, let's face it, everybody's anxious right now. And so that's going to spill over into the workplace. So anticipate, how might my employees react to these changes that we have to put in place? How are they going to react when they look at coworkers and coworkers are wearing masks? What does that prevent?
Yeah.
There's going to be some intercommunication training that you're going to have to do just so that.
I have to say that that before we were going live on this interview, you had mentioned that, and the mental image of our staff at Axial coming back with masks was a little bit mind-blowing to me.
It is, because you can't see your reaction. So it does put a barrier when you can't read. And you want to be mindful of that, but you also want to think about how are you going to address allergy seasons. Right now, the allergies where I live are high. So I'm taking allergy medicine like crazy. How are my coworkers going to react if I'm sneezing? And again, reinforcing your hygiene policies. So it's not the same as it was before. And you need to make sure that you've got good coaching around that and you anticipate that. And on the last call, we talked about how do you rely on your EAPs? I think that's critical. I think that you as an HR person have to have that coach around emotional issues and anxiety issues. So leverage that. Get on the phone with your EAP provider and say, talk me through this situation. It is a new way that you have to operate. But I think that what you need to do is to be very cautious, protect your business, protect your employees, and above all, communicate and document everything that you're doing so that you can then explain. Be prepared for that employee who says, hey, how come Mick's coming back and I don't have to come back? You need to be able to talk about your plan.
Right. What about, some of the things that you expanded on before we were live was, talk to me a little bit about what you think might come out of this with some potential ADA issues.
So what I predict is going to happen in the future is we're going to start learning we're going to see some ADA challenges around accommodations, telecommuting may surface. I think some of those issues, we just need to be mindful. And when we talked last time, we talked about writing policies. So now is a really good time for you to evaluate what is essential within your job descriptions. We have essential workers, but we also have those essential functions. Now is a good time to think about that because we're going through a test. If you've had remote workers and that has worked or it hasn't worked, it's a good time to reflect on that and say what worked, what didn't work, what was our risk, how did that impact the business or our customers. ask yourself those questions. And if you're like me, you have a lot of things on your plate, so you're thinking, I don't have time to do that, but at least start putting that somewhere so you start thinking about it. That's sort of in the future, but you've just gone through a really great pilot, let's say. And
Yeah.
it's to see what worked and didn't. And as you plan for the future, this is not the first pandemic we've been faced with. It's the most severe that we've been faced with in my career. But this isn't the first time we've had this. So it's a good time to go back and look at your pandemic plan and say what worked and what didn't.
Right. Right.
Especially if this turns back.
So, yeah, Lori, how about, any final thoughts on any of this, any advice, sort of bigger picture, come back, don't come back, whatever you sort of like think about from a big picture standpoint as the last thoughts.
So I think do that analysis and think, how is this going to impact my employees and my business? And in my opinion, I think being conservative, if it's not disrupting your business and you can be conservative, think that way.
Continue on, right? Continue on.
You're easing back in. Rushing back in and finding that you're ill prepared, I think it's going to have a more damaging effect.
Right. Just because the governor is saying, get back to work, open up the economy, doesn't necessarily mean that it's right for your business.
Exactly. Right. You have to look at your business through a very filtered lens that says, how is this impacting the business and my employees? And what is my risk? What's my risk if I rush everybody back? What's my risk if I ease them back?
Thank you so much, Lori. This has been really great. Lots to think about. Even more importantly, gets me going that, there's a lot to do. We'll make sure, just as we did in the prior session, to make sure we share your contact at the end of this segment. And everyone keep an eye out for other updates. As a regular part of this series, we'll have Lori back again to expand on some of this as we sort of get back to the now normal, I guess, or the post-COVID workforce. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Everyone stay safe, everyone stay healthy, and keep your eye out for more updates. So thank you very much.